Perspectives, Finding Common Ground, a podcast series that brings together a panel of thought leader perspectives as a forum to socialize and problem solve education technology issues with the goal to ultimately find common ground.
Hello, my name is Patrick Devaney, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this episode of Perspectives, Finding Common Ground. Today, we're going to be discussing learner records in the digital age. And I have to say, I find this topic fascinating. For lack of a better description, I'm using the term learner records to describe a group of evidence types. Credentials, which we're all familiar with, degrees, etc., which are kind of proxies for skills. Competencies, and very often these competencies need to be verified, but competencies with regards to skills, knowledge, or abilities. And ultimately, employment records also fall into this category, and these may need to be verified as well, but they are experiences in employment. So today we're going to talk about how the evolution of technology and the rapidly evolving technologies are impacting and changing the collection, storage, structure, and use of this information or evidence. With me today, I have three fabulous guests, and we're going to go around the horn and give them the opportunity to introduce themselves and share a little bit more about their perspective on learner records, how they define them, what components they find most relevant, and over what kind of period of time they see learner records or they're interested in learner records. So I think I'll start with Bria. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be on here. Thanks, Patrick. My name's Bria Jones, and I'm the VP of Customer Success at Bulb Digital Portfolios. I have always had an incredible passion for education and students. I'm married to a high school teacher. My mom was a middle school principal, and I have served in education in lots of different ways, from developing adult leadership curriculum for a corporation to working in a K-12 public school as well. And so for my last 8 or 9 years, I have been working at Bulb in this area of digital portfolios and really seeing this space open up in this idea of being able to truly tell your entire story. And I think that's the core of what a comprehensive learner record is about. It's about creating a place that allows that learner to be able to showcase their different skills, experiences, their knowledge, and how that all comes together. And so when I think about learner records, I think a lot around something that goes with someone that's attached to them, not the institution, which is where a lot of our records stand right now. A transcript is, what did you take from that institution, or what did you take from that program, or a particular test score is through that lens. To me, that comprehensive learner record is more attached to the individual, and it's gathering things from lots of different places. And I think that's really important in this space where education is changing. I like to call it, it's becoming unbundled. We had these traditional bundled experiences where you go through your K-12 education or your 4-year college degree, and it was very traditional and was bundled together. But now there's a lot of different options in terms of how skills are acquired and learning experiences happen. And so when I think about that learner record, I think about allowing that unbundled experience to be able to come in and be packaged and be able to make those connections and along the way. The other thing I really love thinking about when we talk about learner records is who's the audience and what's the purpose of it. And so I'm always loving to talk, and I can't wait to hear Greg and Michael's perspective on how is this used? So from my perspective, I think about it as not only an outward expression of someone's knowledge and skills and experiences, but how does that inform the individual in their journey and their path in trying to develop goals and reach goals and figure out what's next in their journey? And that's why I really do believe it is a lifelong tool that can happen through all of their education, through employment and beyond, because I really do believe that learning journey never stops there. So thanks for having me, Patrick.
Great, Bria. Thank you so much. Michael, I guess we'll move to you next, please.
Sure. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you're at. Mike Salvatore, go by Mike. Excited to be here with you. Spent my entire professional career in public education, but really in different in different areas. I started out teaching probably the youngest learners you've encountered in public education, 3-year old students with special needs. And I loved being an early childhood educator because I've carried little things from preschool all the way through higher ed. I taught at the doctoral level as a teaching fellow at a local university. And now I find myself in the administrative space again after serving many years as principal, assistant soup, and superintendent of schools. An administrator at a public urban institution in New Jersey, Kane University. I'm the senior vice president of administration. And I look forward to having a conversation today about the learner profile, or as we called it, the student record or the personnel file. So excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us, Mike. I'm looking forward to your comments here. And finally, but not least, Greg, I guess we'll move to you, please.
Terrific. Hi, everyone. So my name is Greg Nadeau, and I'm speaking to you from Somerville, Massachusetts. Um, and my life work really focuses on bringing internet scale to better personalize lifelong learning. First half of my career as CIO of the Massachusetts Department of Education, and in the last 15 years, I've been a manager at Public Consulting Group, working with states and school districts on implementing various different interoperability strategies to bring scale to education technology. Um, so um, my work in this space really began in Massachusetts in 2000 and 2001 with a project called Virtual Education Space. And this was an early attempt to use a FileMaker database to create a database of state standards and begin to align content and outcome results to a database of learning objectives. Fast forward to 2012, I led a project with the state of New York called Engage New York. I led one portion of it, and that was a race to the top initiative that created a open source standards aligned curriculum that 40 million people downloaded. They downloaded the PDFs, and so again, it was bringing this idea of of standards around academic standards, learning objectives, to content. And so we started thinking about how to make that content intelligent, how to make it to be able to be multi-jurisdictional so that it translated. We wrote it for New York, but how do you adapt it to Massachusetts or any other state? And began to think more and more about the outcome side. How do you align micro-credential outcomes that are moving from traditional letter grades systems into something that is more competency skills based? So that led us to some technical standards, a group called IMS Global, now One EdTech, where we created 2 technical standards, one called CASE, Competency and Academic Standards Exchange, which is a way of expressing ontologies as machine readable frameworked pathways and crosswalks. And the second called Comprehensive Learner Record, which built off of the open badge standard to create digital badges that are exchangeable. But Comprehensive Learner Record now kind of extends that into sets of claims around particular achievements that are associated with CASE and other type data. So I work with projects to now implement these technical standards. It's not a technology that you can buy, particularly like you can't buy the internet. It's not a platform. It's a set of technical standards in which all members of the ecosystem begin to express some common shareable data. And the data really focuses on what we now call in a new technical standard, the IEEE P1484.2, the learning and employment record. And so that is that lifelong record that brings together all of the evidence of achievement, particular learning objectives at performance levels from multiple different sources. And so I'll just end by saying that, we have a choice to make, I think in not just in this country, because this is very much a global initiative. Do we see our education records more like our bank account, where you can accumulate funds from many, many different sources and then expend them in some completely different jurisdiction, or more like a medical record, where it's tied up by the provider who really kind of controls those records? So I think the opportunity here is to create much more of more than a portfolio in so many ways. And Brie, I'd be interested in kind of getting your perspective on this. We use increasingly the metaphor of the digital wallet. People used to talk about the badge backpack, and I would joke, backpacks are where you put your gym socks and frisbees, right? Your valuable things go in your wallet. And we're talking about the evidence of what you actually are capable of doing. So that more like a credit card, more like a wallet, more like a thing that you're not just presenting as a portfolio, but you're exchanging with employment and education opportunities to find that zone of proximal learning of where you are and where the next thing is, and to enable this kind of pervasive personalization of education employment opportunities.
Well, great. And thank you all for the initial comments. I think it highlights the broad spans of this work, of this topic. And I think that there's going to be some real interesting kind of outcomes from this, starting with standards, because I've heard standards a couple of times. I've heard, kind of gathering of data, and a couple of use cases start to pop up in this discussion. I guess I'd start by throwing out a question for everybody, and chime in. Whoever feels ready can jump in first. But let's highlight some trends that we see that are happening that are impacting learner records. What is it that we're seeing occur that is changing the way we can perceive or use learner records?
I might prompt Bria and Mike. My perspective on it is that K-12 is retrenching, that there's less innovation today than before the pandemic. There's less focus on master-based learning and project-based learning. There's less constructivist pedagogy. There's a lot of back to basics and survival going on in K-12. In higher ed, there's some movement towards competency-based education, and you have national SNU and Western Governors University and ASU that are kind of trying to bring that kind of scale to competency-based, but still the rest are mostly not. It's really workforce. It's skills-based hiring and advancement that is driving the change. And we see this now cross back over into K-12 in the space of CTE and some apprenticeships and some of kind of the post-secondary transition as people start getting serious about skills. But it's kind of disappointing to me that there's so little of that going on inside of K-12 from my perspective.
Thoughts?
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Did I look like I want to jump through the screen or something? No.
I figured you probably have some thoughts around
Well,
that.
listen, I've had a bit of a hiatus from K-12 in terms of, I've been in higher ed for 3 years now. So I'm somewhat removed, mid-pandemic removed. And I think Greg's classification is pretty broad, right? Like, there's no innovation happening in the K-12 space. Obviously, there are innovations happening that are unique and not necessarily exclusive of CTE programs. Those are great examples, though, but there is wide variability between your top performers who get it, kind of understand this urgency behind building skill and associating that high school diploma to a particular skill set, right? It's not universally applied. We have some high schools that, produce some of the top thinkers and have a lot more resources than others. And you have others, which I love the fact that I had a student reach out to me recently who I've been somewhat connected to her and her family, and she just got accepted to Princeton, but through a portfolio process of demonstrating her competencies. It wasn't and this is an urban public high school student. So there's wide variability across the board here. But the student record, like, let's get back to that, is what we're talking about. In terms of what trends are we seeing? Higher ed's interesting. I don't know if you're following any sports, anybody. Bria, we've talked about baseball a little bit. You've heard the term transfer portal come up a lot. Have you heard that? And that's all about students starting at one location at a college and saying, I want to be somewhere else. And the reason's probably not academic, but the reality is what is going to follow them if they've engaged with an institution 2 years ago, a year ago, and all of a sudden now are going to take that information and apply it in a different setting. What is that new setting, that new home for them actually going to learn about them? Is it going to be a holistic perspective to understand exactly the troubles that maybe they had or the challenges, their strengths? Are they going to be able to translate things beyond credits and understand their competencies? I mean, I think about 2 years ago, I spoke to, I think it was the Kearney College presidents. I was doing a data seminar and we were talking. And at the end, a president said something that stuck with me. He came up, he said, Mike, great presentation. Love it. Democratizing data, very important process. But we're struggling with making sure that the associate's degree is credible to not only the four-year institutions, but to the workforce. And it's tough because we're not innovating in a space where micro credentials are universally applied and accepted, and the skills are applied to the micro credentials. So this is a hot topic everywhere. How do we provide value? How do you assess particular skills? But I do think I am encouraged because although it's happening in pockets, Greg, your mission of scalability, whether it be at a Department of Education or at a private company, is really important. And it can't just be held to those who are in industry to attempt to scale it. We're all in this together. We've got to work together to make sure that we can truly show a record that demonstrates proficiency without being harming. And this is the last thing I'll say here. I've done some dumb stuff as a 19-year-old, as a 20-year-old. And if that record had made its way up to my employment piece by piece, I wouldn't even be employed today, probably. Right. So I just want to say we have to be very mindful that these records have to be very carefully constructed so that it's looking at maybe skill and proficiency level in areas and not the worst decision you ever made as an 18 or a 19-year-old.
Mike, what I'm hearing a little bit is it's not so much about the trends, but rather the challenges. And maybe the challenges are some of what the challenges are changing. And some of that is what Greg is referring to as what seems to be less progress. The landscape is changing a little bit. And, so if our goal is scalability, we're hitting a moving target, or we're trying to hit a moving target.
Fair to say. And it really, I mean, this conversation can go on for hours, but the reality is as technology advances, the record becomes, it seems to be more seamless, but there are more challenges with the digital record because of interoperability, but also because there's so much information right now. I mean, you literally can collect data from a card swipe of a meal to a gym to a tutoring session on a campus. What follows the student and what stays behind?
When we talk about the LER, the vision is one in which those records exist inside a digital wallet application owned and controlled by the individual. And so they are always in control of what records are being shared. And that's this idea of self-sovereign identity and privacy by design. These are your records. These are not the institution's records. They have to keep track of what they have to keep track of. Fundamentally, the consent for disclosure and for presentation has to be vested in the person or their adult custodian if they're not yet of age. So that's a really important part of the design, I think, in order for people to really trust that this is something that, is going to be to their benefit.
The tough thing about that, Greg, is this, and you started with this. Who drives it? We're saying that it's self-sovereign and self-governed, but industry is they're going to start saying, this is what we want to see. So think about the SATs. Everybody submitted the SATs when they went to college. Now, do you see the trend in who's not submitting SATs? If the industry leaders are saying, this is the information we want, it doesn't matter if you can govern it or not, you're going to miss out on opportunities if you can't provide that information to them. So it's,
Yes.
I love the autonomy, the intention of autonomy, but I think industry leaders are going to be driving exactly what you're sharing. So that's a little scary.
No, this is great because it's so multifaceted as we've talked about. There's so many components to it. And Michael, I think you brought up this great point about and gets to that point of what should be in those learner records, who's driving it, and as a student, like, is that advantageous to have everything on there, or what don't you? And I do think we have to learn from where we've been. And so some of the pieces that we've seen and challenges in our past when it comes to data itself is, what kind of data are we bringing in, and how does that identify or define a person? in terms of those next opportunities. And I think this is an opportunity for us with a learner record is to really think about that. And what you were saying too, Greg, about having that more in control of the student of saying, well, what am I presenting forward facing to others? But what is also in my record that maybe isn't forward facing that helps guide me as a learner to maybe understand gaps or direction where I might be more successful or more interested in, or just help me understand where I might want to go? Because I think a lot of us have worked with students or been there ourselves where we're maybe in high school or in college and trying to figure out, well, what is our path? What are those opportunities? And we might look back and go, gosh, I wish I had done that, or I wish I had had that experience, or someone had helped me along the way. I think this is an opportunity for those records to be a part of that story. And so, and I think that's where, from my perspective, that portfolio becomes a softer point of the data. And so it can't be on its own. Those credentials, the how do we assess and really show those skills are critically important. But if we end the story there, we miss what we already are missing right now, which is the same story about SAT scores and GPAs and those transcripts. We miss that uniqueness. And how do those students connect those skills and competencies and apply them well? How do we showcase that? And that's where I think that portfolio kind of plays into that story.
Is it, Bria, is it also that the value of a portfolio, because we're talking about a portfolio right now, is the value of the portfolio the compilation of the records, or is it the creation of some of those records?
Yeah.
We've talked about this a little bit in the past.
We have, yeah. You and I have talked about this a bunch. And from my perspective, and I'm very passionate about reflective learning, and I feel like creating and curating is a reflective practice that helps deepen our learning. And so that becomes the process of it becomes critically important. So if we create this learner record that's 100% populated by other people and institutions, and the student isn't having an active role in that curation and creation process, then we're learning an incredible, or we're missing an incredible opportunity to help them as a learner. Now, and I'd be interested, Michael, is what you think about this too. But my guess is that like anything, it's not all or none. There is going to be data that's populated from other places too. That makes sense. You can't just have everything done and directed by the learner, but it does, as Greg, you were mentioning. I do think this is a record that lives with the learner and goes with them throughout their experience and isn't just tied to a program and institution.
You had mentioned that industry was driving this. What do you see as you get graduates from your institution, and what are the evidence-based demands that industry is placing forward, and how are those changing in order to place students in employment and to carry records of success of your institution going forward as you graduate students? What do you have to do to demonstrate the quality of your education and the benefits of a degree from Keene?
Sure. So, great comments, by the way, so far, in terms of this process, of collecting information. So colleges are typically have a standard of governance by different regional accrediting agencies, or different or specific accrediting agencies according to programs. Not all programs are accredited through a specific accreditation, but most are, and they have these particular standards that they expect you to fulfill. And that process, I sometimes think of the higher ed process and say, wow, that's really unique if we applied that to K-12, because I have this scope now. And what we do is we're measuring those student learning objectives here through different tasks to demonstrate that we have proficiency in particular skill. Is that universal? Not necessarily. And then there's subjectivity. In fact, the talk around grade inflation through the period COVID has everybody in a tizzy in higher ed saying, oh, do they really have a 3.8 GPA? There's been grade inflation through COVID. But here we're attempting to measure those student learning objectives to align them to what we believe are acceptable in industry. Now, certain industries change really quick while others are slower. So obviously, education might be one of the slow barges that travel in the ocean, right? It's not changing significantly quick. As Greg alluded to, in terms of the innovation, it's it's more pocketed. So that big barge moving is going slow and in one direction. It's hard to steer in another direction. Whereas computer science, totally different standards we're attempting to measure with what occurred last November with the release of the development of artificial intelligence, particularly in generative language. That industry has completely been rocked. So some of the standards for student learning that we had just 2 years ago don't necessarily apply. So for us, we have to stay relevant because if you have a degree from a university in a particular program and the employer doesn't find it suitable, they tend to cast a wide net and say, we're looking for people from this institution because they are more qualified in this area. So I think colleges have to be under the gun. We have to feel the pressure of that. And that's why our deans are working with industry leaders, not just for internships for our students to have a capstone experience here, but they're doing that to stay relevant. Because if colleges aren't relevant, and this is the big question today, right? If they're not relevant necessarily, why put out this huge investment? Why pay a second mortgage? Or actually their first mortgage actually would be on their college loans as opposed to a house. So I was a bit all over there, but the reality is we do have a formalized structure, but I don't necessarily know that it's always paired with the expectations of industry.
When you're looking to build a comprehensive learner record, it sounds like it's a little bit of a moving target for Mike and the higher ed institutions. Those what they're using to measure, what they're measuring is changing. And if you want to be able to track that and use it, that creates kind of a challenge around some of the things you're looking to build, does it not?
I think the technical standards, this is where the technical standards come in. I'll give two examples of large projects that I've worked on with clients and how these kind of technical standards can apply. So one large school district in Florida contracted with PCG to provide high intensity tutoring. And we instrumented the tutoring sessions to record an observation of performance level against learning objective. This is the type of thing you can do if you've got, 1, 2, or 3 kids, but it's very hard to do if you've got 25 kids across a broad range of learning objectives in a standard classroom setting. So that was a very kind of precision way of tracking concrete skills, typically math and literacy. The other end of the perspective, doing work with the state now to really reimagine their whole teacher preparation pathway and focusing on learn while you earn apprenticeships for often for folks who haven't completed their BA. And that often, imagine a 22-year-old, 23-year-old, 24-year-old took some classes, didn't finish their BA. They can get employed immediately as a paraprofessional. And there's a huge demand and need for paraprofessionals. And while they work as a paraprofessional, they can earn their BA and get their full professional license and then double their salary. Now, that's a pretty good kind of grow your own competency-based impact, which now it goes to, I think, Bria, where you were talking about unbundled experience. To really bring scale to this is to sort of gamify the paraprofessional to professional educator experience, put it on their phone, put it under their control, let them level up. Every time they level up, they get paid more. When they fully level up to their professional license, they double their salary. So that's where, I think that's where so those are just two ends of kind of precision analytics for performance for high intensity tutoring. And then rethinking the pathway of a recent graduate to become a paraprofessional and then a licensed educator. But they both apply. The same concepts apply equally. And that's where technical standards come in, which is, doesn't matter what software you're using, doesn't matter what the learning experience is. The technical standards allow you to kind of knit back together again all these different experiences under your control, where you then can curate like a portfolio and then present to others these verifiable micro credentials that they then can use blockchain to instantly verify that the record has not been altered and that it comes from who they think it came from. Now, if in some cases that could come from the individual, it's fine in many cases to make claims about your performance in order to better align your next experience. But if it's a very high stakes thing of, who gets to sit in the pilot seat of the airplane and fly the airplane, who comes into the ER as a contract nurse, things where you really want to know for sure that it's not a self-assertion, but someone that you trust has made that claim about evidence of mastery of that individual at a particular level, then at that point you want to be able to, hit a button, QR code or whatever to pair and instantly verify, yep, it came from who I think it came from. It means what I think it means. The record presented to me has not been altered. And that's where you start to see, as you piece together these experiences through your life, a very different kind of vision for, how the economy works, how talent, exchange in this economy, how jobs work, how classrooms work. And that's really the problem with this, I think, is that we get kind of a boil the ocean, science fiction kind of feel to it. And where do you start? And that's why those two experiences I just gave you of it's important to just start somewhere. Start with teacher apprenticeships. Start with 7th grade algebra. Start with 3rd grade literacy. Start with wherever you want to start that's important from a business driver for education, and then begin applying these open standards approaches to enable us to instrument evidence of mastery of evidence of competency of specific learning objectives at particular performance levels.
Greg, I appreciate you saying this sounds like we're boiling the ocean, because in many regards, this is such a big issue. So let's talk about what can we do now? Because I'm a firm believer anyway that change happens in increments, in small increments, but then we compound those. So we continue to grow those and build on those, and we get to we raise the temperature of the ocean, so to speak, by, I guess, polluting one day at a time, or however the problems of global warming come about. But let's talk about what can we do in higher ed? What can we do in K-12 as small steps that are reachable, that are attainable today? So what advice do we have to move in the right direction and still show progress?
I would say to Michael Breer, I suggest pick one place and go deep, right? Try not to go too shallow across too much, but wherever you are with your institutions and the folks you're working with, pick an area kind of as narrow as you can, and then try to get all of the stakeholders who touch that subject area, and unbundle the experience of generating these claims of competency around particular shared understandings of learning objectives.
Mike, I would add, so you mentioned your deans work with industries, and try to adjust the credentials, so you're looking at measuring things a little differently, measuring different things. How does that go from the conversation into practice? Is there a formal way for that, or is it just we've heard this enough, we have to, as a department, we go back and talk about it more?
I'm smiling because in K-12, and this is no knock on higher ed, we could build a road in a day in K-12. I mean, we can be like, hey, we need to build a road, and everybody starts. Higher ed, we've got to study the topography. We've got to, we've got to consult with the contractors, and it's a bit slow moving, and that process is layered here. So it goes through college curriculum committees, it goes through university curriculum committees. If it's a new program, it goes through a state committee. So it is a bit cumbersome. So to change, to have wide, really large, impacting, sweeping change, it takes a while.
Mhm.
But the nice thing that higher ed has is something called academic freedom, which when you start teaching, you start realizing this is a great luxury. And it's around the content you have. So if you have a professor or a department that's really attuned and connected to what industry wants and needs, there are modifications that can be made right in the classroom. Certainly not significant in terms of 80% of the content, but I'm saying a lot of new strategies can be incorporated almost immediately into the classroom. That's the luxury of academic freedom. Whereas I said you can do things very quickly in K 12, they don't necessarily have the same academic freedom. They don't necessarily have the ability to swiftly change the content or add new resources. So there are pros and cons to both, but there are processes within to be able to modify and adapt as long as you're um, connected to the outcome of where you want them to be. Because that career ready cliche, right? The career ready term is really important to higher ed and certainly to K 12.
And I think Bria, your creation of with a portfolio, you're actually trying to implement this in largely K-12 institutions today, right? Are you not? They're using the portfolio to gather and curate the content and evidence.
Yeah, when I think about the question of like where to start, and I like your response, Greg, but I think about it from a perspective of, well, we can have students and teachers right now, and this is what we work alongside our schools, whether it's K-12 or higher ed, that are creating this portfolio. And there is important work around the scalability and the things that you think about a lot, Greg. And from our perspective, the implementation of just having kids curate evidence and be thinking about that to me is a great place to start. And we have been in that space a little bit and it is continuing to grow. And I think that is a great place for that to continue to grow while, Michael and Greg and thinking about more scalability pieces and more standardized pieces across the board are being worked on in the background. Um, there's great benefit to the curation, reflect, and practice, and then having something to show. And then we come alongside that and start to refine that and give more detail about what can go in it and what's resonating with people that you're showing it with. And so I do think that's a great place to start.
I did a TED talk a few years ago that was called Blogs and Badges, the Future of Learning. And, the idea, Bria, I totally agree with you. Blogging, which is a very unstructured form of self-reflection, is, in my mind, where kind of it all starts, right? And just getting a learner to write about their experience. And even if they're sharing it with just their grandparents and, 3 or 4 trusting adults, that is a fantastic, self way to start. Now that's not structured data. The badges part is now these verifiable micro-credentials. So if you think about learning and being like, you're on your journey and you're blogging about your journey, you're writing about it, you're self-reflecting about it. You're then making your own claims of evidence of mastery of specific skills. You're then working with instructors and trusted adults who are then validating that, yes, you are evidencing that mastery, but it all starts with that self-reflection about making it should always start with the learner making a claim about their skill and presenting that evidence, and then sharing it and getting validation and calibration for that they are at that skill level. But it also, so I couldn't agree with you more, Bria, that I think that you don't need to jump all the way, as a learner or as a learning experience all the way into this future of verifiable micro-credentials to get the benefits of just self-reflection and sharing through something like a blog.
I have to. It's clear in this discussion that the experience and the records are all very, very personal. They're individual to each individual learner and their desired path, destination, etc. The question that I have to ask is, when we start tracking these more effectively, when we start capturing them, what are the concerns around data privacy and security? How do and I'm sorry to throw the monkey wrench out there, but it's clearly an issue because we're all worried about protecting our own identity and our own and our own personal data. How does these two play well together?
This is kind of my field, right? I mean, this is the
Yeah.
whole idea here. At the beginning of the pandemic, I took a 4-month break to work on an MIT startup. that was working on privacy preserving contact tracing solutions. And it was going down this same path, which was what kind of got me into this space of self-sovereign digital identity. You can look at Estonia as a country that kind of gets it right, and provides this kind of ultimate privacy preservation with a distributed digital identity that is under your control, that you can use to access what you should be accessing. That is the point, right? That we want the internet of education. We don't want the Facebook of education. We don't want, a centralized platform that controls these things. We need this to be more like your bank account. And yeah, you have a bank and they kind of know where your money is, but that doesn't mean that everyone gets to know where your money is. You have an assumption of privacy and control of your financial data, and that you are, through your credit card, interacting with the world in just the way that you want, right? And so we just need to bring those same practices to our learning records and say that some things you accumulate evidence of for yourself or for your trusted kind of team of coaches, and some things you would share with a prospective employer, and they're not the same things, right? You want these learning records to be very acute about your weaknesses that you're working on, and then also able for you to then frame your strengths to put yourself in the best light. This is very much about privacy by design. States are involved with these things called state longitudinal data systems, and they are increasingly doing what's called P20W+, which is pre-K, K-12, workforce, and plus. But really, which is important, but the answer to this is not one big honeypot central database in the sky, right? That's what was attempted through this thing called In Bloom, which if, you can look it up, it's the Hindenburg of EdTech projects. And it was because there was this idea of like, we're going to create a big central database. It's going to have all this information in it. That is the wrong answer. The right answer is each of us controls our own data, and then we interact under our terms with this ecosystem. Right? So we need to insist that EdTech provides us with that personal data control in every step as we kind of make this transition.
So I happen to have been at In Bloom, so I have a personal connection to what took place. And I think I would add the comment, mission was not the challenge of In Bloom. The method of implementation was the challenge of In Bloom. I don't think that, I think In Bloom was trying to facilitate the gathering and sharing of records by creating a central mechanism, but they did it by gathering that and holding the data in a single mechanism instead of everybody having their own and then sharing it through standardized interfaces and standardized record exchanges. I don't want to digress into In Bloom, but I think it's fascinating, however, that both Mike and Bria, you struggle that the concept of data privacy and security is a challenge. It sounds like in running the institutions that you're working with. It doesn't sound like it's at the forefront of the question, not because you don't want to, but because it's a pretty big challenge. How do you share what has to be shared and still make it very secure?
Yeah, I mean, I think from our perspective and just coming out of Bold and what we're doing with our own portfolios, you know, we have put a lot of like permissioning pieces in place to put the owner of the portfolio in control of what is shared with whom. And so, whether that's something that needs to just be shared with a teacher, shared with grandparents, shared more out to the world, but still all in one place. And that's kind of a big component and something that differentiates us from maybe some other sharing platforms. And so we're at that side of it. And I think that's working really well for us. I think what Greg's talking about as we get even more into um, that digital identity and those credential pieces being shared, that there's some complexity in some of that privacy, but absolutely needs to be considered. It's such an interesting take that you brought up, Greg. I hadn't heard of the In Bloom project, and as you were just talking about the difference in approaches and um, how important thinking about that in those different ways is really important from that privacy perspective. So,
So this is something I smiled at it and I deferred to Greg and Bria because this is the world they live in. I'm probably on the other end of the scope where we just attempt to do whatever we can so we don't get hacked. A data breach for us is tens of thousands, of hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars, and I've watched it as a superintendent happen to my neighbors, neighboring school districts, where you get a call, an alert comes out, and they're like, "Oh my goodness, someone's got my information, and I've got to give I don't know 300,000 in Bitcoin to some stranger." Right? Like, this is a reality. So there are some things that you can do in-house in terms of keeping that tidy, which we attempt to do. When I came to higher ed, it was the same issue. Everybody's worried about, these big data pieces being taken over, almost held hostage to release them. So when I think about the collection of intimate data that's personal by individual students, it's the same concern exists. If I can't keep an institution safe that has a team around the security of their privacy, and particularly some of these things are just sloppiness, keeping portals open for maintenance. That's like the number one way people are hacked in terms of their systems. What about students? What about that C student, average, below average student who says, "Oh, I forgot to hit the protect tab," or whatever mechanisms put in place to protect their privacy. I mean, I'm not worried about this. This is all going to be various iterations of it. But it is something, if we're not talking about the reality that happens out there, that your information, whatever you're collecting, can be accessible by somebody else that you may not want to have it. So we've got to be mindful in what we collect because it eventually can be revealed. So I would say there's plenty of curricula out there that teach around data privacy and your digital footprint and what you're collecting. And I think the sooner we can engage our youngest learners in that process, the better. But yeah, it's a hot issue, Patrick.
I have the sense that we could probably talk about this topic all day for weeks and still uncover new aspects of it. Um, what I'd like to do is try to summarize a couple of kind of some key themes that I'm hearing as takeaways, and then I'll give you guys the chance to kind of validate or refute those if you think that I've gotten it wrong. But I'm hearing a couple of things are pretty clear to me. Number one, this is a huge issue, and addressing it is an evolution, not a revolution. It's not something that we can go in and fix overnight, largely because of legacy systems and technology in some cases, largely because of legacy processes and differences in the processes of different parts of the education or learning um, adventure. Colleges are going to evolve probably more slowly once they make a decision to do so than K-12 institutions. But K-12 institutions may be slower to get to the point where they're ready to change. So there are some major differences there. There seems to be a sentiment that industry is going to drive a lot of this. That is going to come from industry, and they are going to apply pressure about what's shared, and that's going to force educational institutions to deal with it. I think also technology is compounding this challenge because while it's providing new paths, it's also creating kind of a moving target to create these solutions. We talked a bit about some small ways to make change and then kind of leaning into those to make bigger change. That might be a strategy that can be successful. And I think ultimately one of the biggest takeaways for me is the importance, the significance, the absolute requirement that the learner controls what is gathered and how it's used. There are lots of benefits for their own learning by gathering and compiling information, but that doesn't mean that that necessarily is open for sharing unless they choose to do it, nor should it be considered open for sharing unless they choose to do it. And I guess the final note is many of the places where we do see success in this come back to career and tech ed because I think there's a lot less credentials out there, formal credentials, and a lot more skill and ability based presence or value in showing what they've learned and how they've learned it, rather than the credential. It's not going to be fixed overnight. It's going to take time. And it's going to take time and collaboration and cooperation across many, many different groups. I have to say, I would love to have this conversation again. Maybe in a year, let's come back and revisit it and see what's changed. See if any of our thoughts have changed. I find it a fascinating and really, really critical component, not just to education, but to our society, to our communities, and something that I think we need to advocate and work with policymakers and others to protect the privacy and yet support mechanisms that really allow for people's abilities to shine, because that's really how we continue to grow and expand. I thank you all so much for your time. It was wonderful. I learned an awful lot. Audience, I hope you have as well. And until next time, thanks so much.
Thanks, Patrick. Nice to meet you, Mike and Bria.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Michael, you're great.
Thank you for listening. ClassLink is proud to be the meeting place to facilitate these conversations. If you have a topic idea, send it to perspectives@classlink.com. To keep hearing our perspectives, be sure to follow us on Apple and Spotify and subscribe to us on YouTube.